In today's tutorial, I'm sharing hands down the easiest way to paint a loose watercolor flower. In just a couple minutes and a few quick steps, you can create a stunning floral painting to be proud of, and I'll show you how to add some leaves as well. This is the perfect way to get your feet wet with loose florals, especially if you're a beginner. You can get comfortable with your supplies and feel more confident before moving on to any of my other floral tutorials here on YouTube. So let's dive right in. Before we start, if you're curious about any of the specific supplies that I'm using in this video, all of them will be linked down below in the description box. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start by getting a pretty wet pigmented mixture of this paint onto my brush. And once you load up your brush, we're going to start with the very easy method. So I'm just going to tap my brush down and make 5 little dots in the shape of a circle. So I'm just tapping my brush down just like that. I'm going to reload so I have enough paint on my brush. And each one of these little dots will serve as the start of a petal. So it just looks like that. And now I'm going to rinse off my brush completely, but I want to make sure that I still have water in my bristles. So I'll rinse off all the pigment, make sure I still have a decent amount of water. And I'm just going to start pulling from each of these little dots. I'm going to pull using the tip of my brush and then apply pressure down to create the petal. So you can just watch me do this here first. Applying some pressure down and lifting back up. Applying more pressure down and lifting back up. And that will be how we create each of these petals. So my brush is nice and clean, I just have water in it, but I'm pulling color from those little droplets that we put down first, and that's where all of that pigment is coming from. So starting with the tip of my brush, applying some pressure down, and lifting back up. And this is how we're going to create each of these petals. So don't overthink it, just apply your pressure down, lift up, and lift up, and then we have one more petal left. Use the tip of your brush, apply some pressure down, lift back up, and the same thing right next to it. So there we have a very basic flower. Now, one thing I do like to do, and if you've taken any of my other tutorials, you know what's coming next, but I like to dip my paintbrush directly into the paint and just tap back a little bit more of that color right into the very center. And that just helps to deepen the contrast a little bit more. And there is our first flower. So I'll show you a couple more ways to do this that will start to look a little bit more full and vibrant, but that is just the very beginner basic technique. You drop down, if you want 5 petals, you drop down 5 little droplets. If you want 6 petals, you would drop down 6 petals. And then you just use your clean, damp brush to create those petals using color from the center. So let's do that again. This time I'm going to bring you in a little closer, and I'm going to do another 5 petal flower. So you can see my brush is nice and loaded with color and water. And I'm just going to gently make 5 little dots for where the petals will be. Okay, so there's our 5, and now I'm going to rinse off my brush completely so it's just clean water. And what the rinsing off is doing is it's allowing me to create these very beautiful, light, almost translucent petals. If your brush was still filled with pigment, it would look a little bit more like gouache or acrylic, more so than watercolor, because it would be loaded with color and almost look more opaque. But having clean bristles, but drawing color from the middle allows you to get that nice transparency. So starting with the tip of my brush, you can see my bristles expand out onto the paper there and lift back up, and the same thing right next to it. Applying pressure down and lifting back up. Remember, we're painting in the loose style, so your petals do not have to be perfect shape. You can see this one's kind of twisting down. This one has kind of a weird rough edge, but that is what makes loose florals so beautiful. So again, applying pressure down and lifting up, and same thing right next to it. And I'm gonna rinse off my brush again. Every couple of petals, I like to rinse it off just because every time I do this, I'm getting more color in my bristles and I wanna maintain nice, clean and clear strokes. And I'm just gonna continue to do this, working my way around, starting with the tip of my brush, letting that brush expand out on the paper to create these almond-shaped petals. So we already have a couple of really beautiful flowers, and here, same thing as we did last time. I'm just going to tap in a little more darker pigment in the center. You can see it expanding out into the petals. I love that look. And now I'm going to show you how we can level up these flowers a little bit. So once you get the hang of this very basic technique, this is kind of the foundation for so many different types of flowers that you can make. But almost all of my loose florals, I start with really pigmented dots in the center and then create my petals from those. But let me show you a little bit of an elevated version of the same flower. So to make it look even more beautiful, you can just add a second color. So I used one single color for both of these first two flowers, but even just by introducing one more color, it can really transform your flowers. So let's do this again. I have some warm yellow in my brush, and I'm just going to start making a couple little random marks here in the very center of my flower. I don't need to make them very precise like those first ones were because this is just the very center of the flower. I'm not actually going to be pulling any color from this. And now I'm going to rinse off my brush and I'll go back to the same peach pink color. And I'm going to do pretty much a similar technique to what we just did, but instead of each little droplet being its own petal, I'm just going to make a little ring around the yellow. So I'm just kind of loosely making some dots here. I still want it to be fairly pigmented, but I'm just kind of tapping loosely my brush down so you can see this imperfect and irregular ring. Just like that. And now I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm not pulling from one single dot like we did earlier. So we have all of this pink to pull from. So I'm just going to kind of drag out using the tip of my brush just like this, and then start painting in my petals. So I don't have one single droplet to pull from, but I have many. And you can really create as many petals as you want. So that first stroke, you can see I'm just pulling out some of that color and then creating these really beautiful dainty petals. Now, one problem you might run into as you do this is your paint might dry up a little bit. Because we're not using big globs of color like we did the first time, it's a little bit smaller, so it might dry up, and in that case, you can just add a little bit more. Just like that. So now I'm going to go back in with my clean bristles and create some more petals, using the tip of my brush to pull out a little color, and then just applying pressure down in creating those petals. So it's a very similar technique to what we just did here, but you can already see this flower looks a little bit more elevated and a little bit more sophisticated, I guess you could say, just by adding that second color. It just brings it up a notch. Pulling out that color and pressing down. And you can see some bleeding happening here. I personally love that. I think it's kind of a key indicator of loose florals is having those colors bleed and bloom. But if that bothers you, just practice your water control a little bit. So the more water and the more pigment you're working with, the more likely it is to have blooms like this. But I personally love it. So just pulling out a little more color here. And I can fit one more little petal here, but first I need to add a little more pigment because it's starting to dry up. So just keep an eye on that ring around the center because if it starts to dry up, you won't have any pigment to pull from. But you can always add more. All right. So we had 8 petals in that flower. So it's a very similar technique. All of these flowers, we started with heavily pigmented marks in the center and then pulled out for the petals using the same strokes, using the tip of your brush and then just expanding it out. But look at the difference. So this is a very basic, simple flower. It's still very beautiful, very pretty, and it's a great way to add like fillers to your compositions. But adding this second color and adding a few more petals just helps it look more alive and full. So let's do that one more time, and this time I'm going to have a few less petals. We had quite a few petals on this one, and how many petals you add is usually determined by how big that center is. So I'm going to make this one a little bit smaller, and I'm going to start with my yellow pigment again and add just a couple of tiny dots here in the center. Rinse off my brush, and then I'll go back in with my peach pink color. Of course, you are more than welcome to use any colors you'd like, but I'm just going to make a little bit of a smaller ring around the stamen. So look at the difference between this big one. It allowed a lot of space to add petals, and this one's a little smaller. It's almost more the size of the first two flowers that we practiced together. And now using a clean brush, I'm going to pull out. So again, that first stroke is just using the very tip of my brush, pulling out a little bit of color, and then doing the same thing right next to it. Letting your brush expand down on the paper and lifting back up. And I always talk about this in my watercolor classes and my other tutorials, that muscle memory is such a key part of improving your watercolor skills. So even if it feels a little bit repetitive, which it is, the more you practice these things and the more you get comfortable with your brush strokes and the way that your brush interacts with the paint and the paper, the more it'll just start to feel like second nature. So for me, creating petals like this, I don't really even have to think about it because I do it so much. But of course, when you're first starting, everything feels a little unfamiliar. You're trying to figure things out, but it's a really beautiful flower, and you get a lot of good practice doing all these types of flowers, and you get lots of different variations. They all look pretty different other than the first two, because that was the exact same, but we're using the same technique but getting different results. So that is the foundational technique that I love to teach for florals, starting with pigment in the center and pulling out that color for the petals. And then of course, just as the last step, adding in a little of that dark pigment to deepen the center. So now let's practice adding some leaves, because leaves can really take your flowers to the next level. Now I do have a whole other video, I'll link it up at the top here, about how to paint leaves, and that's a very step-by-step, kind of more thorough, in-depth lesson for how to do that. But for this beginner tutorial, I'll just show you the basics. So to create just a most basic, simple leaf, you're doing a cadence of light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. So what I mean by that is you're going to load up some green in your brush, and then you'll go light pressure, so you're barely touching the page, heavier pressure, you can see my bristles expanding, and then light pressure again. And that's going to be your basic leaf shape. So that, and then another thing that I like to add to my leaves is just very wispy strokes. I use the tip of my brush and just create a mark like that. It's like a fine tip little stroke. And this will probably look familiar if you have seen any of my other tutorials or you're familiar with my artwork. That's something I really like to add to my floral pieces, just to kind of make the compositions look a little more lively. So now let's do that same thing, but onto a flower. So I have my green loaded up into my round brush, and I'm gonna add a little leaf coming off of the side. So light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. Let's add another one. Start really thin, light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. And you can just create these really, really beautiful leaves. Light, heavy, light. And now let's do some of these wispy marks. Like I said, I like to just add these little embellishments to my floral pieces. I'm using the tip of my brush and just kind of barely touching the surface of the paper to create these little wispy stems. So now let's add some more down here. I'm gonna go light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure, light, heavy, light, It's a very similar stroke to what we did for the flower petals, but I just kind of drag it out a little bit more. Light, heavy, light, light, heavy, light, but it's that same cadence of light, heavy, light every single time I add a leaf. And it just creates these really beautiful shapes. So again, just using the tip of my brush to kind of fill in any gaps and add a little bit of movement. And there we have it. So you can really add as many or as few as you want, but it just really takes your flowers to the next level, and you can kind of see the progression. We had the first two that we practiced, which were very basic, but still great flowers to know how to paint. We did a bigger one where we have kind of a large stamen, gives us a lot of room to add petals. And then we have a smaller dainty center with 6 petals around it. And then when you add the leaves, it really just turns it into a beautiful motif. Now I mentioned this earlier, but there are so many variations. You can see already all these different variations, but you can also vary your petal shape. So let's do one more flower and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So again, I'm gonna do a similar stamen to this one. So just making small little marks in the center with the yellow, and then I'll load a decent amount of water and pigment with the pink color to create the little ring around the center. Just barely tapping in some dots here. And now, instead of doing the same kind of almond shaped petal that we've been doing so far, I'm gonna create more of a rounded, fluffier, fatter petal. So instead of really expanding out and lifting back up, I'm gonna create shorter ones. So I'm really pushing down hard and letting my brush expand and rounding it out to create this fatter petal. So let's do it again. Use the tip, pull out some color, and then I'm not dragging it out too far. I'm just pushing down so that my bristles in my brush expand to create that fluffy little circular petal. So it's shorter and it's a little more rounded than the initial petals that we've been painting. Pull it out. I'm just not dragging it out as far. I'm curving the edge and creating a petal. And same thing here, if you start to run out of pigment or it dries up, you can always add more. So do you see my bristles there? They're really expanding out really far, and that's what's giving that circular shape to the petals. It's a lot more circular than the almond petals. Now this one's a little too light, so I'm just going to go over it one more time, adding a little more pink pigment and just repeating that process just to darken it a little bit more. And there's another beautiful flower. So it looks very similar, but it has a different shape to the petals. So that's what I'm saying. This technique, it's a very simple technique. It's a good foundation, but there are all these different variations you can make to make the flowers a little more tailored to your style, whatever your style may be. So now let's go ahead and add some leaves to this one too. I'm going to load up kind of a little bit of a darker green and do that same technique. So starting light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. And then using the very tip of my round brush to create those little stems poking out. And don't be afraid to really make it your own. So I'm just showing you all these different ways to get started. But don't feel like you need to make the exact same brush strokes that I'm making, because I really want you to start feeling confident making your own floral pieces. And there we go. Now I do have tons of other floral and botanical tutorials here on YouTube, as well as a handful of longer, more in-depth classes on Skillshare and on my website. Everything will be linked below, so be sure to check those out when you're ready to learn some more. Thanks for painting alongside me today. I really hope you enjoyed learning this technique, and I will see you in another video very soon.